All right. So, as I said, we have three types of muscle in our body. Okay, the three types of muscle are our skeletal muscle, which are the muscles we think about a lot because they're the muscles that let us move. They're the ones that are our legs, our arms, all of our external things that we use to move around and to breathe. Okay? The second type of muscle is called cardiac muscle, so heart muscle. So this is the muscle that's in our heart that causes our heart muscle to contract, and it contracts continuously throughout our lifespan. The third type of muscle is a smooth muscle, and this is the muscle that's around all of these internal organs and all of our blood vessels and all of our gastrointestinal tract. So what these muscles do is they contract slowly and they contract in a rhythmic fashion. And we're going to talk about a bunch of different aspects of how we control the muscle, how the muscle looks, how it's nucleated. That means how many nuclei or how many areas where there's where the DNA is within the cell. How many of those in each cell do we have? And then we're going to talk about how each cell is connected to the one beside it. All right? So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about skeletal muscle. So skeletal muscle is our arms, our legs, all of the muscles that we think about as we move and breathe. So you're not going to be surprised to know that we control these voluntarily. So there are some involuntary skeletal muscles, but the majority of them are voluntary. And even the ones that are mostly involuntary, like some of our sphincteric muscles, so these are muscles that we use to hold certain aspects of our body closed so that we don't embarrass ourselves. We have a little bit of control over those ones, even though we don't have to think about it all the time. Okay, so those are voluntary muscles. Same thing with our breathing muscles, our intercostals and our diaphragm. Those are muscles that work in the background, but if we want to hold our breath, we can stop them from working for a while. Okay, so all of these muscles are voluntary. The skeletal muscle also has this idea of striated muscle, and you can see in my picture here that it looks like there's little stripes there. And that's what striated means, is that the muscle appears striped, and it has these striations in it, and the striations are these stripes. And what the striations are is that the proteins are arranged in such an organized fashion that even though the proteins, we can't see any of the single individual proteins, that they're so regularly oriented that we can see how they all come together to form a shape. It's like looking at something from way up high. If you've got like a drone that's flying way above, and some of you might have done this in high school, is where you all stand together as a group for your senior year picture. And when you're down low, you can see the individual faces, but then you've done something to spell out your school name or something. But you can't really see it when you're down low, but when you go up high, you can't see any individual's face or you can't see their body, but you can see the shape that they've made. Same thing is happening here with our skeletal muscle. We see these striations. We can't see the individual proteins, but we can see the shape that they're in. When we talk about nucleation, these little black dots on the side of the skeletal muscle cells, these are nuclei. That's where all of our DNA is stored. That's the cookbook with all of the recipes to make your whole body. So the DNA is held within these nuclei, and the nuclei, what you can see is each muscle fiber or each muscle cell, skeletal muscle cell, has more than one nucleus. And that's because what's happened is when we're making a skeletal muscle fiber or a skeletal muscle cell, we've taken a whole bunch of smaller cells and fused them together into one cell. So when we say how are the cells connected, they're fused together into these unbranched tubes. So these long tubes that are actually quite thick. And the reason they're thick and long is because we've taken smaller cells and we've fused them together. We've caused them to come together into this much bigger cell. All right? Now, in contrast to our skeletal muscle, our heart muscle or our cardiac muscle doesn't look exactly the same. It looks somewhat similar, but there are some differences. The first important difference is that it's involuntary. We don't think about our heart and change how our heart beats. Now, there are some gurus and all kinds of really cool folks around the world who slow their heart rate, but that's not by directly regulating how much the muscle is contracting. That's by changing how much our brain is turning on and how frequently our brain and other signals are turning on our heart. So you can do that by regulating different aspects of your nervous system, but you can't actually directly cause the heart muscle to contract when you want it to contract. Like skeletal muscle, the proteins in our heart or our cardiac muscle are striated. And again, you can see that there are stripes here. They're just not as incredibly regular as in the skeletal muscle, but you can see there's stripes in this area, and then there's this disc here, and there's another disc over here and here, and that's how these cells are connected. They're connected through what are called intercalated discs. So what these are the cells come together, and one cell forms a disc that hits another cell so that those two cells form a really, really tight connection so that they don't get pulled apart from each other. But because each one of these is a cell, they usually only have one nucleus within the cell. So instead of fusing together and making these long tubes, now what happens is two cells come together and they form this really tight intercalated disc here so that they're bound together, but they're not one cell together. So hopefully that makes sense. In the skeletal muscle, instead of making the disc, what they do is they just open up a channel between the two cells, and now the two cells are connected. Whereas in the heart or in the cardiac muscle, they just keep that disc in place of the fusion. All right, so these are single cells that are connected by these strong discs. And lastly, smooth muscle. Smooth muscle, it's called smooth because it's non-striated. You don't see these lines in the smooth muscle cell. Here, this is completely involuntary muscle. So these are all of our gastrointestinal tract is moving food down your GI system from your mouth to your ends. So they're going to be in there. They're going to be in all of your arterioles and other blood vessels so that you can direct where does the blood go so that your system can contract certain blood vessels if we need blood to go in a different direction. So these are things that we can't control voluntarily. So these are completely involuntary things that are happening kind of on autopilot in the background. All right, as you can see here, each one has a little black nucleus. The black nuclei are different than the skeletal muscle where they're all on the outside and they're all together and there's lots of them along these long tubes. These are individual cells. Each one has a single nucleus. The cells are unfused and they're just normal shaped cells that aren't tubes like you see in the skeletal muscle and the cardiac muscle. All right, so what we've got here is unfused cells. They're single cells that come together. They do a job together, but they don't produce a huge amount of force the way our biceps would. They're producing smaller forces, just enough force to close a blood vessel or to cause your food to get pushed down your GI tract. Okay, so it's a very different type of muscle, smooth muscle. And so what we can see is that we've got two different kinds of striated muscle, skeletal and cardiac. We've got two different kinds of involuntary muscle. We have cardiac and smooth muscle. We have different ones that form tubes. So there's two different muscle types that form tubes, skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle. And we have two different types of muscle that are single cells are producing the force. That's cardiac muscle and smooth muscle. Whereas single nucleated cells, whereas the skeletal muscle cells are multinucleated. Okay, so this is just one of those things that you have to kind of go through and try and understand all of these different components of what the different muscles are like.